Welcome, everyone. It's such a pleasure to have you here today to our DIACC Research and Academia Forum. These events, our DIACC Research and Academia Forums, are opportunities to connect research and academia with digital identity, to connect the priorities and the interests of these communities, to learn from each other, and to move forward on some complex, often complex topics that are very important for our society and for how we move forward and interacting with technology for the benefit of people. We have a fantastic topic and set of panelists today. Today's topic is digital ID and facial recognition in an emerging AI legal framework. Which is, of course, something we're all paying attention to, I think it's fair to say, these days. So we're thrilled to have you. I'm Joni Brennan, President of the Digital ID and Authentication Council of Canada. I'm going to be your moderator today for this amazing panel that I'll introduce momentarily. And one thing I love about these research and academia forums is that it really, for me personally, is always an opportunity to learn. We have such expertise on our panel, so I do my best to moderate a thoughtful conversation, and I always learn a lot through through the insights of our panelists, and I know that you will as well. So before we introduce our group for today, also I do want to share some reminders that we are recording today's session. So this will be available after today. We do ask everyone to keep their phones and their microphones and their cameras muted and off. So that will keep the audio clean and the visual clean. We hope to have time for Q&A at the end. That's what we're planning for, at which time we can turn our microphones on. We have asked that you do update your names in Zoom and your organizations. That helps us to know who we're speaking to. We do have a code of conduct. We treat everyone with respect in these conversations. We always have and will continue to do so. So we appreciate the respect that our audience always has for each other and for our opinions as we go forward. And also the opinions that are shared within this discussion today are the opinions of the speakers. They do not or may not necessarily represent the organization that they're associated with. So this is an open discussion forum and each person is speaking on their own behalf, myself included. So setting a little bit of our ground rules for today. Now, as we go forward, I will just do a quick around our panel and ask them to introduce themselves just with the key highlights that they'd like to share. I find reading biographies can be very long and it's always more dynamic to hear from the person and what they would like to share about themselves. So maybe just a quick introduction from Somaieh Nikpoor. Please introduce yourself to our group today.
Sure, thank you, Johnny. So hello, everyone. I'm very glad to be here today. As mentioned, my name is Somaieh Nikpoor. Okay. I'm an economist turned data scientist. I started my career on a PhD economic tracks, but I got very interested in data science, machine learning, and I started kind of searching my career towards the machine learning. And I have been working in this space for the past 9-10 years. I'm currently the lead for the data science and AI strategy at Transport Canada. But when I'm not dealing with Transport Canada files, I'm usually working and collaborating with a lot of non-for-profit organizations on issues like AI policy and responsible AI. So I'll pass it to my next.
Thank you so much, Somaieh. Thanks for joining us today. Let's go over to Charles Morgan. Charles, would you say hello, please?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Nice to meet you. So I'm the co-lead of our law firm. I'm a partner at McCarthy Tétrault based in Montreal behind me. I'm the co-lead of our national cyber data group, former co-lead of our technology law group, former president of the International Technology Lawyers Association. And I'm somebody who's been keenly aware around issues related to the responsible deployment of artificial intelligence for a number of years.
Thank you so much, Charles. Thanks a lot. Appreciate that. And while we're at it, I'm in Vancouver, actually Whistler, British Columbia right now. Charles said he's in Montreal, Quebec. Somaieh, are you in Ottawa?
Yes,
Wonderful.
I'm joining you from Ottawa.
Wonderful. And over to you, Bernhard.
Yeah, thank you, Johnny. Yeah, my name is Bernhard Strobl, and I'm sitting here in Austria. I studied informatics, so I'm a very technical guy, I would say, and I'm working for the AIT, the Austrian Institute of Technology, let's say for the last 35 years, starting with embedded electronics and informatics and all this stuff for surveillance purposes and things. In the last 13 or 15 years, we did a lot about border management, and it turns out that yeah, biometric identification is needed. Yes, and it would work good and best if you have good images and good samples, and this is what we are doing. So we are trying to improve the convenience for all the people to get good biometrics, I would say, and this raises some problems, and maybe we can talk about this today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Bernhard, for your introduction to the group today. Wonderful. So with that, let's turn to our discussion for today. We do like to base our discussions in use cases and put them into the Canadian context and also into the global context. We know that a technologically connected society is not necessarily behind traditional borders or jurisdictions and interacting in those types of borders and jurisdictions as we had pre-technology availability. So the same is true as we move into the topics for today. So we'd like to start off with rooting our discussion within some facial recognition use cases, and particularly we'd like to start actually in the European Union. We've definitely seen the European Union moving forward and shaping global framework for AI regulation. More recently, there's been proposed the first law on AI by a significant regulator, the EU AI Act, and the EU also launched the OECD AI principles to be a user-friendly policymakers and regulators and legislators. We've also seen the UNESCO regulation on ethics and AI, really the first ever global agreement for ethics and AI to come forward. So in this context, Bernhard, you're coming to us from beautiful Austria, and could you share with us some examples of that you're seeing for facial recognition use cases on the European side of your experience?
Yeah, thank you. I tried to find a use case which is interesting also on the governmental side and which touches also the private side. So to start with, I think since 2 or 3 years ago, there had been new so-called IO regulations, which are interoperability regulations by the European Parliament, meaning that the police now on the street is able to identify persons directly on the street. And this means officers can try to capture, or they are allowed to capture fingerprints and faces directly on the street, because what they're doing what they had been doing in the past was if somebody has not an ID and was not able to identify himself, so they have to take the person, put into the next police station, make an ID, all this ID stuff, and this needs time and effort and was complicated, and yeah. So what we did is we, in fact, the AIT developed an app, because we're in the lucky situation that all of the Austrian officers have the same type of iPhone, which are 30,000, and everybody has the same. And now they can use an so-called photo app, but it's not a photo app. It's much more complicated. It's an app which automatically can filter out the correct ICAO style photos from a video, which means for the officers at the moment now, it's not necessary to make a good photo for identification, because as you already know, if you want to match a face with a face in the database, you have to take an image which is has the most quality what you can get. And if this quality does not fit because of the shadings or the angle of the face, so also the recognition does not work good. So this app automatically judges an image about quality. And now comes the trick. This is done with AI. And so this raises, of course, some problems. Yeah, maybe we can, there are more questions about this, but this is the use case. And yeah,
Absolutely, and it definitely raises. So let's you noted it raises some concerns. I think you started to touch a little bit into some of the benefits, but why don't you would you spend a moment on what you're seeing regarding benefits and concerns around what's come forward?
Yeah. So one of the things definitely is, if everybody heard of this, everybody was saying, oh boy, so what can the police now do? So they can store my data, they can do everything just with the smartphone, no regulations and so on. And this leads us to also to the next question, because we have to be very transparent what's going on. To be honest, the interesting thing is that what the police is doing now with the app is not more what they are doing before, but they can do it in a much more efficient way. And that's the interesting thing, in fact. And of course, maybe we touch this also later, maybe by Somaieh, but when we use artificial intelligence algorithms for, let's say in this case, it's not so a big problem, because the algorithm just wants to find the best face, which is not so a severe problem. In fact, it does not the recognition and the matching. It just wants to find the best face out of a video stream to get later on a good match. But if this algorithm is trained with a bias, then we have a big problem. So this is one of the most critical problems we also face when we are developing new things for, let's say, contactless fingerprints, and we train these AI systems. We have to be very, very sure that the data we use for training is not biased, meaning a very good distribution about age, gender, ethnics, and that stuff. So this is one of my key messages, what I want to talk about today, and this is very, very important.
Yeah, would you say, in terms of the training with not biased practices, what would you say are some of the optimal or best practices? It sounds like training with no bias is one of the top ones.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the new AI Act goes in the right direction, because it goes for definite good and transparent documentation, which is very, very important, I would say. One of the things I learned also in the last 13 years, having a good informed consent. But this comes also from the general data protection rules, the GDPR rules from the European Union, which raised tremendously the sensitivity of private data. And let's say an informed consent sheet of paper, when we are doing some tests, for instance, is not a one-pager. It's now a four-pager, because it describes in totally detailed and clear words, understandable for everybody, what's going on, what we're using with your data. And this is the next point, it includes the right to be forgotten. Also one important point of the GDPR. So this is one of the very important things. And yeah, and the bias, to avoid the bias from the beginning, let's say per design, is one important step. Yeah.
Certainly. So I think, you've set a great groundwork, I would say, Bernhard, in terms of our kind of where things are coming from on the European Union side. I think you touched into the new act and some of the good practices where things are moving forward. So thanks so much, Bernhard, for setting a little bit of that groundwork context on the facial recognition use case side. I think that was very, very helpful. So let's turn, and Bernhard also highlighted and started to touch into some of the concerns and some of the policies around in the EU space. So let's turn to the Canadian legal space with focus on the legal framework, or a legal framework, and ethics. In October 2022, the Government of Canada released a report on facial recognition. thus far, the Canadian legal framework has no specific law aiming at AI. Bill C-27, or the Digital Charter Implementation Act, I think is at its second reading now, looking to reform privacy and modernize privacy law. And Bill C-11, also building on Bill C-11 and privacy law, starts to introduce the Artificial Intelligence Data Act. So we're starting to see movement in this space in the Canadian ecosystem for governance and ethics by design into our way forward. So let's start with, let's ask the question from the Canadian side. Has Canada put in place a legal framework that actually addresses the principal risks and fosters principal opportunities raised by facial recognition technology? Do we yet have that legal framework around risks and opportunities? This will be for both. We'll start with Somaieh and then we'll move to Charles. Thank you.
Yeah, sounds good. Canada is taking the first steps to build this sort of framework. As you mentioned, that the Minister of Innovation, Science and Economic Development tabled the first draft of the Canada's Digital Charter Implementation Act back in 2022. Basically, that was an act to enact the existing Consumer Privacy Act and also the Consumer Privacy Protection Act, and also the PIPEDA, the Personal Information and Data Protection Act, and an added element to it, which was the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act, a completely new act that was not before. Basically, was the first attempt of the government of Canada to start regulating artificial intelligence. So basically, the idea what is called the Artificial AI and Data Act. So the purpose is to regulate international and interprovincial trade and commerce in AI system. That's basically by establishing a common requirements that is applicable across Canada for the design, development, implementation of the AI systems. So of course, this act is prohibiting certain use cases of this AI system that may result in harm to individuals. They define harm in so many different shapes in this act. They call it physical harm, psychological harm, damage to individuals' property, economic loss of individuals. So although this act addresses the possibility of kind of various harms and, as Bernhard mentioned, biased outcomes by this system, but there are some limitations in terms of when it comes to the human rights and fundamental rights. This is the area that I feel like this act requires quite a lot of work in that front. So what one may ask that, okay, this is an act about AI, how about the facial recognition? Why do we talk about AI but not about facial recognition? The fact here is that the existing shape of facial recognition technology that we currently today have is rendering it power into AI systems, into how the advancement of the AI system. That's why by regulating this AI system, we are enabling the fact to start regulating other aspects of the use cases of this AI system. I may actually like to take a step back and just maybe talk about the facial recognition technology history, because using computers to recognize faces is dated back to 1960s. It was a group of researchers in Palo Alto, California. The research center was called Panoramic Research Center. They started actually to do computer programming to recognize human faces back in 1960s. And since then, the facial recognition has gone through a huge evolution and changes over years. It was in early 1990s that more technical and holistic approaches and new methods started to improve the facial recognition, the way that they measure, for example, try to linearize the measurement of different aspects of your facial features, for example. And then it was another improvement, another new methodology back in 2000 that rendered itself to more improvement in how to actually extract some of these features, more advanced techniques. And there was another new sort of methodology, was mainly a learning base that is very much very basic to some of the AI algorithm we currently today have that is used for facial recognition. The major year in the history of facial recognition technology was in 2014. It was when Facebook published the deep fake model, which they use some publicly available, there was a label database, they call it LFW data set, that they use that data set and develop this deep learning model with accuracy of 97%, very close to human kind of level recognition. And they worked on it and improved it, and 3 years later, they improved this model and they got to 99.8% accuracy. That was a big deal in the AI community and deep learning sort of techniques. And although this technology have been around over the past 10 years, so what has changed over these years is actually the AI itself. The AI powers the use of biometric technology. So this deep learning algorithm that was developed by Facebook, the type of this algorithm that is used in this case is, they call it CNN, convolutional neural network. There are cascades of multiple layers that tries to extract features from just one single image. Imagine millions of extraction of information on different sort of features, and then would allows to enable that facial recognition. And that was possible because all the advancement in AI and deep learning, and also the computation power that is now actually available for all tech companies, and also some, I guess it's compared to 10 years ago, is very much publicly available. So this advancement in AI is powering the use of biometrics technology, including facial recognition application, which can be used for either verification, identification. So I guess we all can expect that in the next coming years, facial recognition is going to be substantially used in the marketplace. But it raises a lot of challenges and issues worldwide, especially when it comes to biometric surveillances, as Bernhard mentioned, because although facial recognition can have real benefits, especially when it comes to public safety and security, there's definitely values in using this technology. However, the intrusiveness and also the pervasiveness of this technology, and also the fact that these are black boxes, as I mentioned, there are layers that is very hard to sometimes figure out, okay, where did bias, as Bernhard mentioned, where are these biases, where that error happened? It requires a lot of work and technical expertise to figure out how does AI system end up making a sort of a specific output decision or verification or identification. So although there are benefits, but because of all these challenges, and also the challenges around the data protection and privacy, it would require more effort than just thinking about the risks aspects of these systems. As Bernhard mentioned, EU AI Act is a risk categorized. It's used the risk categorization framework, and that effect is actually what that Brussels effect that they call it in public in a policy area is coming to the North America, because, for example, the NIST risk standards, they're all using this framework because that's how it seems to, because they look at the outcome, the usage. However, the main element when it comes to regulating these technologies, how this technology are impacting our fundamental rights, our human rights. And I feel like, and probably in Canada, this EU AI Act is trying, hopefully, to address these challenges in the next draft of the next draft of this bill. But it's not just going to be facial recognition, it's going to be AI as in general, because it enables a lot of downstream technologies such as facial recognition.
Wow, Somaieh, I'm for this space in general, I will say I am both. I kind of oscillate between excitement at all of the possibilities and utter and complete fear about where this is going to go and governance. And I think you really covered a landscape there, and in your response. And then also, you know, part of the reason that I personally, and I know a lot of the people that I work with in DIACC, why we're involved in digital identity, is that many of these technologies can be both used for beneficial purposes and for not beneficial purposes, and there's so much context between what's beneficial and what's not, and managing that risk. And I really appreciate your point that risk is not enough. So thanks for sharing those points. Now I want to turn over to Charles from the legal side and adding more context into what you're seeing in your ecosystem. Sure. Yeah, Charles, take it away.
So yeah, I'm the lawyer on the call, so I'll try to kind of focus on elements of the law. And the question as posed was, has Canada put in place a legal framework that is adequate to address the principal risks that are associated with and to foster the principal opportunities that are raised by facial recognition technology? And so far, we've heard about the AI and Data Act, which is in the form of a bill that even the federal government indicates that it's not likely to come into force anytime before 2025. And then after they even when it comes into force, they're going to focus on education before they focus on enforcement. So that's a long way off. All right. So then the question comes, well, what do we have in the interim? And is the legal regime that we have in place currently adequate? And I think to answer that question, it's important to take a step back and take a look at three different sets of considerations. The first are, what kind of use cases are we talking about? And the second is, what are the risks and opportunities that each of those sort of use cases represent? And then the third is, are we talking about public sector or private sector scenarios? Because the legal framework that applies to the use cases, the legal framework that applies to the private sector and public sectors is very different currently. So turning to the use cases, the first thing I wanted to flag is, I think, a pretty important distinction between FRT used for identification versus FRT used for authentication. So identification is what's referred to as a one-to-many scenario. It's like, I've got a crowd. I want to see who's that person at the back of the crowd. Who's that person? I want to see if I can have FRT identify somebody from a group, within a group. Authentication uses is, I already have the person in front of me. I want to authenticate, verify that that person is exactly the person that they say they are. And as you can appreciate, I think the one-to-many scenario raises a lot more legal issues and concerns and ethical issues than the one-to-one scenario. If we're just trying to match identity and confirm that you are who you say you are, most people can get fairly comfortable with that. It's the one-to-many scenarios that really start to make people anxious. So to give an example, if I go through a customs and security clearance at the airport, I'm probably not too terribly fussed if the government customs agent says, instead of just like eyeballing my passport and saying, yeah, you kind of look like the person on the photo, they actually use some technology to make that assessment more effectively. Not too worried about it. I understand the context. It's a one-to-one content. I understand, how the data is being used for what purposes, and it's sort of obvious that this is being a use case that I'm comfortable with. But then imagine another scenario. It's not just the customs agent at the airport that's using the technology, but the airport itself, a private sector entity, is monitoring all people in real time to make assessments about everybody who's passing through the airport. And maybe they want to say, oh, well, that person looks like they've got way too much money. Let's try to move that person through the duty-free counter and make that duty-free process have more friction, so we spend some more money. Or, here's another scenario: police using a one-to-many technology to monitor a protest. I might be very concerned that the police is conducting mass surveillance on a. So I think that scenario is that distinction is actually pretty critical. Then, depending on what context we're looking at, are we in a heavily regulated industry like financial services, where there's all kinds of regulation around how financial services or healthcare entities can collect and use personal information. Those kinds of contexts may well be absolutely, subject to all kinds of the legal protections that we would want. Whereas other scenarios, if it's an unregulated industry, that might not be the case. Okay, so understanding the use case is going to help us understand whether we have the legal tools in place already to address them. The second thing is, what are the different risks that this FRT technology raises? And I think depending on the risks we're looking at, we have more or less legal protection already in place. We have some of the risks are that we've already talked about are the risk of biased or discriminatory outcomes. You know, the technology may be more or less effective, and depending on what populations we're talking about. Some research has established that facial recognition technology is 10 to 100 times more accurate with white males than it is with women from the Asian community or from the Black community. So the scenario about how it's being used may raises a lot of risk. There's concerns around invasion of privacy, right? Big concerns about illegal invasion of privacy, the use of this technology without awareness or consent, potential over collection of personal information, inappropriate uses of personal information, concerns around an assault or potential assault on human agency, human autonomy, and some fundamental rights and freedoms, concerns around potential for lack of accountability. Who's using this technology, and are they really subject to rules that force them to be fully accountable for their actions? And as I say, it varies again whether we're talking about public sector or private sector. The private sector is regulated in a very different way than the public sector is. So, putting all of those pieces together, if I were to then answer the question, or start to answer the question, is Canada ready for facial recognition technology, and is the law in place? Start by saying ADA is still several years away from being in place. So what we have is we have a patchwork legal framework in Canada in which some of these risks that I've just talked about are addressed more effectively than others, and they are addressed more thoroughly depending on whether they're talking about certain provinces and whether we're talking about private sector or public sector. So to take the example in Quebec, Quebec is currently the first province in Canada that has fully modernized our privacy legislation, and we've done so on the basis of trying to align ourselves with the EU GDPR, so the privacy legislation in Europe. Quebec law currently imposes an express consent requirement related to the collection of biometric data, so facial recognition data, for instance. It imposes heightened accountability provisions, such as the requirement to conduct privacy impact assessments when acquiring new technology systems that process sensitive personal information, like facial data, or when transferring that data cross-border for processing. It includes very elaborate transparency and explainability provisions whenever this data is used in the context of automated decision-making systems. It introduces new constraints on profiling location technologies. It's refreshed and enhanced provisions related to the establishment of biometric databases. And there's huge fines if you don't comply. So in short, all of those requirements in Quebec privacy law greatly reduce the risk of harm of using facial recognition technology. And so the concern, but Quebec currently is the only province in Canada that has that legislation in place. So there's that big gap. I would say, if anything, the concern in Quebec is that they are imposing constraining a use of regulatory burdens, and so it may well prevent the use of FRT in cases that are that would be very valuable. But you can see the current gap is, well, Quebec's solid on privacy, put it that way, and more than solid. The rest of Canada a little bit less so. Second scenario, if you turn to the federal government, well, the federal government, so public sector use by the federal government, already has in place a regime and tools that are designed to help address the risks that I've already identified. It has the Treasury Board directive on automated decision-making that imposes requirements to implement privacy impact assessments whenever you use these kinds of tools that are privacy intrusive. The federal government is subject to the Public Sector Privacy Act. And there's the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So uses around discriminatory, concerns around discriminatory uses, these are all addressed. So I think, in short, there's some gaps. We don't have a consistent privacy regime across all provinces. We don't have a consistent approach as between private sector and public sector. ADA has the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act has not yet been adopted. So concerns that we see addressed in the European AI Act, like prohibited uses of mass surveillance technology, that does not yet exist in Canada. But we have a patchwork regime that addresses some of the risks in some contexts, with gaps in between.
I feel like that this is such a Canadian answer, that we have a laws and regulations, and we address in some places yes, and in some places not. I mean, Bernhard, do you feel the same in terms of patchwork? You're not the lawyer, but do you feel the same in terms of a patchwork in the European Union side of things? Is there a similar sentiment in your perception?
No, I would say what was just mentioned is totally right. And I'm really happy to see that Canada is trying to take up on some ideas of this EU AI Act, which is really, really interesting. But maybe you give me 2 minutes to make a little bit of an experiment, because I want to for the auditorium, I want to read something about the new AI Act, about the proposals, some excerpts, and I want to see your reaction, because this would be very interesting. So in fact, the EU AI Act is a proposal for a new regulatory framework. Fine, everything on this is clear. And it does a clear definition and classification of AI systems. The EU AI Act proposes clear definitions and classifications of AI systems based on the level of risk they pose to safety. Fine. Fundamental rights and other social values. This will ensure that the regulatory requirements are proportionate to the risk posed by AI system. 1 point, totally clear. Prohibition of certain AI practices, exactly what was said before. The proposal includes a ban on certain AI practices that are considered unacceptable at high risk, such as AI systems to manipulate human behavior, used biometric data for surveillance. We had all this already now, and to create deepfakes without disclosure. Second point. Third point, increased transparency and accountability. Maybe it's too long, I will skip this. And harmonization of regulations across the EU. So these are the 4 pillars, in fact, of this 120 pages document. And now comes the trick. What I read here was generated by an AI. It was not generated by me. It was generated by the ChatGPT.
Yeah.
I checked it, and it is right. Was written by this ChatGPT at the moment. Mm-hmm. This is something what I wanted to draw into the discussion, because this is something useful if you use an AI to, let's say, generate the bullet points of something, but not trust it in the whole sense. So it makes a problem when you want to overlook the whole scene, because you cannot be sure that it is right. It helps you, but the final decision has to be made by human.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And I know that I'm also one of those people who's been experimenting a lot with the ChatGPT and what the long language model and predictive algorithms can do, and recognizing the difference between where they're providing augmented use for work, for example, but also where they don't have the expertise and the fine grain expertise on particular topics. But so I think also, so that was fun, Bernhard, thank you. I think also the, Charles and Somaieh as well, you both got into, everyone has gotten into transparency and touched into human rights. And Somaieh, would you say, how, in your view, how is public sector, and recognizing that you're not speaking for governments or for different governments, but in your view, how is public sector Are there other ways, in addition to what we've spoken about today, that public sector you see is taking action on the human rights side of things?
Yeah, so specifically in the context of Canadian federal government, as Charles mentioned, so for the federal government, the directive on automated decision making is basically is mandatory for all government departments. If they want to start using and implementing an AI system, they have to comply with this directive. As part of this directive, the government, the department, they have to do what is called the algorithmic impact assessment, which basically is a sort of a questionnaire that asks you a series of questions about your AI system, not just about all aspects, about the project aspect, stakeholder engagement, technicality of the model, and the outcome, and the environment that is going to be used. So based on the score that you receive from this impact assessment, then a series of mitigation is recommended. If the risk associated to this system is so high, this directive wouldn't allow the departments to actually use that AI system. This is quite a very strong tool, which is currently under its third revision across the government of Canada to improve and also expand the reach of this directive for various AI technologies. So this is in the context of the Canadian government, but it seems that other countries, for example, EU AI Act, for those there are certain AI risks that are prohibited, such as, I guess, what they mentioned, the public real-time surveillances of facial recognition. These are prohibited cases, but let's say if there's a case that a member state can justify for safety and security of their citizens, they want to start this, for example, facial recognition technology, they have to go through a conformity assessment, which as a part of it, they have to also take into account some of the human life and probably human right impact of those systems. So it seems that through some of this regulation, there are the governments across the globe, they are putting some measures in order to make sure that you start benefiting from these new technologies. However, in a very sort of restricted way, make sure that we know what's going to happen at the end. But the challenge, as again what Charles mentioned, the making regulation is a heavy machinery. It takes time. It takes years to get to have the final draft, and the pace of the technology is completely different than the pace that the regulation is moving forward. Just as Bernhard mentioned, ChatGPT was released a few weeks ago. A week or two after that, it was GPT-4 released, and then Google started releasing Palmy. These are all extremely powerful AI systems that does not fall into the definition of AI that currently the EU AI Act is offering, because the definition of AI is constantly changing because the technology is constantly changing. So imagine there's going to be a continuous kind of conversation about, okay, how are we going to go about this regulation if AI is constantly changing? Maybe we have to come up with a definition that is neutral, and it doesn't, if the technology advances, it doesn't impact the regulation around it. Again, I'm not a lawyer, do not have a legal background, but I can see how complex this can become. And what I was going to conclude from this conversation is that there might be some sort of, I'm hoping, I don't know if you've heard, just a few days ago, a series of research and academia and leaders in the AI kind of released a letter asking to stop to put on in development of a model like ChatGPT or GPT-4, because us as a human community, our collective, kind of our society, we have to decide where we want to go with this technology, what we want to do with this technology. And I feel like this is a much broader conversation. I don't know that's going to happen. This letter was released a few days ago asking for a 6-month stop for any expansion on any type of AI system, especially these ones that are very powerful, but it's not very clear that this can be done. But yeah, it's an open-ended question, and I'm looking forward to see how things will turn out.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. Yes, and I did see that news about the stop, and it really reminded me also of where we have been with genetic engineering, and where there's kind of common global approach to where that should begin and end, but not every country is bound to that type of consensus, right? So this is a common thematic within our structure. And I wanted to draw maybe one more point for Charles. I'm definitely off script a bit here, but Charles, we also worked with yourself and the Human Technology Foundation and a set of diverse stakeholders on a white paper around policy design principles for digital identity. And all of these technologies fit together. And one of our principles was on having choice and volunteer opt-in adoption. One thing I haven't heard us discuss today is people and their choice. Now, of course, the airport model, I don't have a choice to show my identification card, like that's a mandatory. But do you have any thoughts, noting that I didn't prepare you with that question? Any thoughts on choice in the context of AI from a legal perspective?
Yeah, let me think about how to answer that. I mean, the privacy law is so fundamentally based on the consent paradigm. It's this notion that there's a contract. You're going to tell me what information you're going to collect about me, for what purposes, and I'm going to be it's going to be all very transparent. I'm going to have a very clear sense of how that's going to work. And if I agree, if that's a fair transaction, whether you're paying me something or I'm going to get an excellent service, then we're good. We've got a nice exchange. It's all around transparency and it's about consent. But what happens, is that the way the world works these days? Like a lot of cases, companies and governments are collecting information in contexts where there's no transaction, right? They can be screen scraping data from thousands, if not millions, of social media websites, or they could be filming a crowd, or they could be applying AI on data sets that have terabytes of data, and using that data for purposes that were never contemplated when the data was initially collected. In that context, how does that consent paradigm fit? And let me just, I'd like to take a moment to talk about the Clearview AI decision, because I just think it's so fascinating, and it raises so many of the issues that that have been floating around as we've been discussing here. Clearview AI. So Clearview AI is a private sector company that collected screen scraped images of something like 3 billion people, or 3 billion images, like just massive scale of facial images. And then they analyzed the characteristics of the facial data, and they started selling products to, among other things, police departments. And so one of the sort of stated use case was, well, we're going to help police departments and law enforcement identify criminals. Can't dislike that, right? We're all good. We're going to stop the bad guy. We're going to, as a matter of fact, assist police departments with the, deal with child exploitation. So dealing with child exploitation crime center, they had a relationship. So seems like a very good purpose, seems all good, but notice a few of the complicating factors. First of all, it's a private sector entity is in a commercial business context, right? They're collecting data about billions of people, and not just like you and me with that consent model that we talked about a moment ago, right? They're collecting it for purposes that were probably never contemplated when the data was initially posted on a social media website, right? Wait a minute, I thought it was just sharing my happy event with my friends last night with other friends. Turns out I'm putting myself into a database to see whether I'm a sex trafficker or something like that. It's just, this is a totally different scenario. And anyway, so the privacy commissioner, as a matter of fact, a joint process amongst the variety of privacy commissioners across Canada, took a look at that Clearview scenario. And to be clear, the police departments, the law enforcement, thought this tool was fabulously powerful, very important, really important public service that was being delivered by the Clearview AI technology. So it's really important to understand that this is not just like a bad guy kind of scenario, a complete misuse of personal data. But the privacy commissioners said a few things. First of all, they ultimately said that the collection of this data was not for an appropriate purpose, because in fact the potential purposes and use cases of this data was so varied. It could be used, yes, to stop the exploiter of children, but for criminal purposes, but it could also be used for a whole bunch of other commercial purposes, and we don't know what those are going to be. The second thing is they raised the concerns around accuracy and discrimination, and they pointed out the fact that these AI-based databases that are being plugged onto AI being trained on data sets that are absolutely massive, their error rate becomes much higher when you're talking about certain marginalized communities, or at least portions of society that are subject to discrimination, human rights protections. And so there's the possibility of accuracy concerns. There's a possibility of discriminatory treatment. And then to your main point, what about consent? And what the privacy commissioners clearly said was that these uses were not done. This is sensitive personal information. It should be collected with consent, unless you fall into a narrow exception to that consent rule, and they felt that was not happening. So I think it's a very interesting use case where a bunch of complex issues were being addressed all at once related to the precise point that you just made.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Charles. Yeah, I do feel it's such a complex landscape, and I just as a person, I do feel like I'm a part of kind of this social experiment about when and where AI shows up. I mean, we're all, for anyone who's already participating in social networks or even using things like YouTube, all of these tools, and we've been watching what's been happening with TikTok. So we're all sort of subject to the invisible hand of AI algorithms, whether we've consented to that or not. And that also, those algorithms have changed over time and where and how they nudge. So some of this is fascinating to see as part of the model for how the influence model for advertising and how the internet has evolved, and this type of connection has evolved over time. We certainly did not expect to answer all of these complex questions and to provide a solution for these complex questions in our discussion today. We did aim to illuminate some of the areas of overlap and areas of difference between what's been happening, the Brussels effect, what's been happening in EU, what's been happening in Canada, our commonalities, and some of the connections between policy and legal frameworks around digital identity, facial recognition, and AI. And I think we've done this today. We've got some fantastic questions. I think a couple of questions in the 3 questions that we had into the chat. My concern with the 3 questions is we only have 5 minutes left in our conversation today. And what I'd like to do with the 3 questions with our panelists is we will capture those 3 questions, and we'll share those questions with the panel and ask them if they would follow up in a message, and then maybe we can post those as comments to the video when we've got those up, because 4 minutes just won't do it for the types of questions we have. So thank you for asking those questions in the chat. We'll capture them down and pass them forward and try to attach those as notes when the video is published. I do want to thank our fantastic panel for joining with us today. I will ask you to do one thing though that I think we can do in 4 minutes. Let's aim for 4 minutes. That's our close time. 3 minutes actually. One piece of actionable advice for closing gaps between public and private sector. One piece of advice. Maybe you nodded your head, Charles. One piece of actionable advice for closing gaps, trying to close gaps.
Sure. So I'll do the one piece of advice for sort of on the privacy front and on the government side, on the industry side. So on the government side and on the regulatory side, I think it's essential that they recognize the use cases and the risks associated with FRT are not monolithic. Don't say, oh my God, this is facial recognition technology. It must be bad, must be dangerous, must be whatever. To go to my one-to-many, one-to-one scenario, if I use if my iPhone uses facial recognition technology to open up the telephone, and or my bank uses it so that I can access my bank account, that's just really good, really convenient technology that's providing an excellent service and raises very few privacy concerns. But if the FRT is being used to surveil mass protesters, that's another scenario. And let's be clear that those are very different scenarios.
Yeah.
On the industry side, and so don't treat them all the same. On the industry side, use this technology seriously, use it responsibly, conduct privacy impact assessments, conduct algorithmic impact assessments, implement privacy by design, responsible AI by design, because you have to build trust and you have to merit trust.
Amazing. Okay, thanks for that advice, Charles. 60 seconds. One piece of advice, Somaieh, for the audience and for thinking about closing gaps.
Okay. I don't call it a piece of advice, but what I think is no single country can attack or think about AI in isolation. This is a global thing. I mean, industry, private sector. I feel like anything that is going to happen in this realm, it has to be at the global stage. I feel like policymakers, policy leaders started at the OECD AI principles. I think that was a good initiative. Then the UNESCO recommendation on AI Act. But the fact is, none of these are binding, legally binding. I think I have my hopes up to the current convention, the Council of Europe Convention on AI. They are putting together, this is an international organization to protect human rights and fundamental rights. For European members, also there are a few non-members join as part of this OECD. I feel like a global convention that takes countries, industries, government, everyone accountable in this realm, because we cannot expect a big tech to do something differently in one country to another country. We want to protect the people in our planet. So imagine thinking like something like a human right convention on human rights is for everyone across the globe. Something like this is required for AI to protect everyone, at the same time treat industry and public sector in the same manner. So I hope it's not more than 60
So we got
seconds.
use case specific, enumerate risks, context there. We got global, need to look at it in the global lens. Bernhard, you get the closing comment today, 60 seconds.
Oh, which honor.
No pressure.
30 seconds. No, I would say give as much information what is possible in a consent way, with enough transparency, legally binding. And the second big point for me as a developer is try to make privacy by design systems by design, which means from the beginning, try to avoid any bias what's possible. And this comes again back to the thing with information and transparency. If you say, okay, I'm using this data, if I'm allowed to use this data, then you can build nice and valuable AI systems, which should
Wonderful.
bring
Thank you. Thank you, Bernhard. Great advice from our panelists. Thanks so much for sharing all of your insights to all of our panelists. Thank you for taking time for our discussion today. I learned a lot. I know that our audience did as well. Thank you to the audience who joined. We'll follow up on those questions. I hope everyone has a lot of thought from our discussion today, and we'll keep the conversation going. And we appreciate your time and the opportunity to learn together from the insights that were shared today. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.